Hello and welcome to Chapter 3. This chapter focuses on listening and human communication. So what we're going to cover in this particular screencast is going to be the different stages of listening, the different styles of listening, perhaps a few barriers, reasons we don't listen so well, and that's going to be it. As always, please remember that this is an overview of the chapter, not a comprehensive in-detail lecture that will cover everything your chapter has. So please make sure to check your textbook and keep up. All right, so to begin today, one of the things I'd like to go ahead and kick into would be how listening is defined. I'll move my head out of the way real quick. And listening is defined as the ability to perceive information from others. It is generally a psychological trait, not a physical one. The physical act of sound hitting your eardrums would be considered hearing because that is the actual measurement of sound and the reverberation inside of your head. Listening is a psychological choice, something that you do actively make a decision to do. For example, many of us have been in class, I'm sure, and we've been hearing what the lecturer has been saying, but not necessarily listening. Because listening is a conscious choice to remove distractions, to focus the mind, to ask good questions, and to make sure that you are a participant in that conversation. If you think about it in a conversational standpoint, whether it is a marital relationship, friendship, family, whatever it might be, listening is exceptionally crucial because there is a difference between sitting still while somebody else talks and being an active participant in that conversation by listening to what they have to say. So the basic stages of listening would be, first off, the reception of the information. So this is whenever you are actually encountering the communication. So right now, I would assume that you all are listening to me, not hearing me. If you are just hearing me, then quite frankly, it's a waste of your time to go through these. These are here for you to listen to and to participate in and to make sure that you focus on. So the reception stage is whenever the communication begins and someone is communicating something to you and your brain is sitting there absorbing that information theoretically. Now, as we receive information, the next stage that we automatically kind of click onto would be the understanding stage, and that is when we start making meaning out of the communication that is coming towards us. That's when your brain is sifting through the information while you are listening to it, and it's kind of categorizing it, bringing up past memories, definitions, examples. It's finding a way to make sense of what has been said. I'm sure a lot of us have probably had the experience of someone has been talking to us, and for some reason it's just not making sense. But the more that you sit there and focus and think and just kind of Rolodex your brain through that information, it eventually clicks and you go, aha, okay, that's where they're coming from. This is where this is going. Okay, got you. So that's more along the understanding stage. The remembering stage is exactly what it sounds like. This is when you store it in your memory, and actually that would represent the components of the conversation that you do recall. On average, I believe that the National Listening Association has determined that at best we remember about 50% of what we are told in a day, and that's that day. So at best, we are cataloging half of all the communication that's been sent to us. On day 2, we remember approximately 20% of that. So you can imagine by day 3, a substantial amount of the communication we've had on any given day is gone. This is why note-taking is relatively crucial, because that's what's going to keep you on point as you go through your information. Now, another thing that we can keep in mind as we go through this is while we're remembering, we also have to sit there and evaluate the information we're given. And this is when we might analyze it. We might analyze it later. We might tell ourselves to remember it. If you've ever had a conversation with someone about having a bad memory, then you might have to focus a little bit more on putting this evaluation in the memory box in your brain. And this is when we are going for meaning even deeper than what we had when we originally understood it. And we are evaluating what an appropriate response might be. And that would be stage 5 whenever we start actually responding in the communication situation or later. So listening itself, while it has 5 broken down stages, of course, as you might guess, we go through all 5 of those very swiftly. Sometimes we go from reception to feedback inside of 1 second. So your brain is used to doing this very, very effectively But listening, again, is that psychological decision to pay attention and do well with that information. Whereas hearing, you're skipping the understanding, remembering, and generally the feedback stage too. So hearing, you're kind of missing almost all the stages. Listening, you are an active participant in each one of these. Now, as you might guess, we have a lot of listening barriers in our lives, things that keep us from paying effective attention to what's going on. And the biggest one in our current culture right now would be distractions. Whether it is your phone, or whether it's family, or whether it's emotional noise inside of your head, we are in perhaps what I would consider to be the most distracted generation ever. Between all the avenues for entertainment, constant technology contact, we are constantly getting pulled away from the focus that we could or should be having. So one of the things that I kind of want to mention with distractions is how to be an active participant in removing those. For example, right now, while I'm doing the screencast, I do have my phone here, but it is on silent, not vibrate, because if it vibrates, I'm going to want to know who messaged me. So it's completely silent, so there are no distractions there. And I actually have it turned face down so I can't even see. And I do not have that little flashlight function. Some of you might have the flashlight function where every time you get a message, your phone flashes. That's just as distracting. Don't do it. Another thing is whenever I do these screencasts, I tend to close my email inbox so that I don't get any more notifications while I'm talking, because that will distract my brain. It might distract you visually if those pop-ups come up. Another thing is my office door is closed, and I even have a sign on the door saying that I'm recording a screencast in an effort to reduce distraction and interruption. Now at home, whenever you are watching or listening to these particular screencasts, you need to be an active participant in removing distractions. If you're listening to this while you're on your phone, texting your best friend, while you've got TV on over there, even if it's muted, while you're cooking, while you're you're dividing your brain's ability to pay attention to what's being said, so you're kind of wasting your time. There is a lot of research coming out about multitasking and how we are less effective at that than we are pretty much anything else we do. And while I like to and have historically said that I'm amazing at multitasking, in doing multitasking exercises, I have realized that might not be as strength as much as we think it is, especially when it comes to listening and information recall. If it's important for you to bring information back, whether it's on a test or in a conversation or in an interview, you have to make sure that when you first absorb that information, that you do this in a distraction-free environment. An exercise you could try could be to listen to one of these screencasts with all of your normal life going on around you, and then rewatch it later, but this time consciously deciding to remove all distractions. You have nothing out except something to write on and something to write with. Everything else is gone. The lights are low, the doors are closed, everything's quiet, you've got headphones in, no phone, no TV, you are right there. And then you could compare which one of those two screencasts you got the most information out of. I bet it would be the low distraction one. Another thing that is a barrier to our ability to listen is, of course, our personal biases and prejudices. If we are biased to or for or against someone or something or an idea, or we are prejudiced for or against someone, something, or an idea, that is, of course, going to kind of interrupt us while we're listening. Think about it. If you're listening to the radio, TV, whatever, and someone represents a political viewpoint that you don't agree with, what do you immediately do in your head? We immediately start arguing back to that person in our head and coming up with 16 different reasons why they are wrong and we are right. So while you're doing that, how's your listening going? You're arguing with this fictitious person in your head now, so are you actually giving your attention to that person? No. So since you aren't giving your attention to that person, your bias has interrupted your ability to focus. Next point, lack of focus. Again, I think that our distraction-heavy environment increases our lack of ability to focus. If you naturally do not have a very long attention span, at best, adults have an attention span of 30 minutes at a time before they need a reset. On average, college students have an attention span of 8 to 11 minutes. And on average, professors, I think, have an attention span of like 20 minutes. So that's why these screencasts are shorter instead of like an hour and a half. We're trying to keep them under 15, 20 minutes. So even if you need a break halfway through, you can do that. So what I encourage you to do is do a little bit of research on refocusing activities. What can you do to kind of quickly cleanse the brain and get back in it? One of the tricks I have my students do in class is just to look at the corners of the room with their eyes and track from corner to corner to corner and then back again just with their eyes, and then kind of go the other way. Sometime that's a 15-second reset. That buys them another 8 minutes. Other times I encourage them to get up and stretch. I never tell my students to stay still. I'm like, get up and stretch, walk around the room, pop your knuckles. Whatever it is that you need to do to kind of get that brain back on track, do it. The last thing that people tend to do that hurts their listening is premature judgment. And I would like to differentiate that from bias, because bias tends to do with emotions and actions. But premature judgment is whenever you assume you know what the other person is going to say, so you kind of cut them off or tune out. Now, you might be right. Sometimes people take a lot longer to say what it is that they need to say than we think is necessary. On average, we speak about 100, 125 words per minute, but the brain functions at about 400 to 600 words per minute. So yeah, we are 4 times ahead in the conversation than the mouth is. So premature judgment can be a barrier to listening, because if we make assumptions, we tune out. Think of you as a student. If a lecturer is going over something you've already heard a lecture on, what do? Click. I encourage you to listen anyway, just to work on improving the length of your attention span. Now, your textbook does go over several listening styles. These are the ones that are in your textbook, and the one on the next slide is not going to be in your textbook, but they were both kind of 2 different interpretations of the same thing. So these listening styles tend to be how we generally listen in a conversation, because all of us kind of have a way that we like to listen and a way that we don't like to. An empathetic listener is a listener that listens to feel the emotions of the other person. That's empathy. Sympathy is feeling bad for someone. Empathy is feeling what the other person is feeling. So an empathetic listener is someone who listens in order to tune in and feel the same emotional balance that the other person has. So if you're upset, they're listening to understand and be upset with you. If you're happy, they're working on being happy with you. A polite listener listens to be polite. Not a lot of attention there, but they're being polite enough to not interrupt you and to be a part of that conversation. Critical listener tends to evaluate everything that they're hearing. Sometimes they will actually critique more in the conversation, but generally they are looking to evaluate and assess the content. An active listener is someone who is the most involved. They are kind of a mix of the 3. They want to feel what's going on. They are being polite and not taking their turn away from you. Whenever you're talking, they are listening to evaluate and assess. They may offer critique, but mostly they want to make sure that they're going through those listening stages consciously and decisively. Now, listening orientations, again, not in your textbook, are generally the conversations that we are attracted to. And the big one there is these are just the different types of content, I'll say, that we like to listen to when we get into conversations or lectures, the examples that attract us. And the people listening orientation means that you are invested in listening to conversations that talk about people. This could be their background, their hobbies, their interests. You might be attracted to reading biographies or autobiographies. If you discover a band on YouTube, you might research every single member of the band, all their albums, all the people. You probably are the person that could tell me every statistic about every sports player on any team. So if it's about a person, it's interesting and you want to know because it's something about that person that's interesting to you. An action-oriented listener listens best when they are being given a task to complete. They provide the most attention when they know that there is a purpose behind the communication. If it's just general conversation, they don't really have a lot of use for that. But if there is a purpose, like here are the 6 things I need you to do today, or please know this information because you will use it here, then they can tune in a lot more. An example that I could use is when I have a lot of action-oriented listeners in my classes, I will say something like, make sure you know this slide, you will use this on X assignment, or these 3 ideas will be on this test, so they know that there is a point behind that communication. If you have an action-oriented listener in your life, make sure that you phrase it as in, here's how this conversation is useful to you. That's how you'll get the most attention out of them. A content-oriented listener is all about details, 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 and more details. They are obsessed with the contents of the conversation regardless. It doesn't matter whether it's about people, action, time, what have you. It is primarily going to be just about knowing everything there is to know about that content, period. Content-oriented listeners tend to evaluate the most. They'll spend the most time metacognating, which means thinking about thinking. They will think about that communication deeply long after the conversation has ended. So if you're the type of person that's going to bed at night and has to replay the day's conversations before you go to bed, then you're probably a content-oriented listener. The last one is a time-oriented listener. And a time-oriented listener is less connected with the amount of time that it takes, or I should say it's less connected with the content and is more connected with how long it takes to say. So this could be a person that has an attention span for conversation that's 10 minutes, for example. And it doesn't matter what you're talking about, but at the end of 10 minutes, they're kind of done. They're ready to move on and go on with life. Whatever it is that you say, you have a limited amount of time to say it in before that person loses interest. Generally. So our general last topic of the day here is going to be the fact that there are, of course, definite differences in how we listen and how we interpret information, and that culture is going to hit heavily on this topic. The way that you've been raised, who raised you, and the belief systems behind that, and the conversational styles in your culture are going to very much impact the way that you listen. My family, for example, interrupts everyone all the time, every day. So in our family culture, it is perfectly acceptable to step in and talk over somebody if you have something to contribute. We don't necessarily talk over people to change the subject, but we do talk over them in order to add to it. In my spouse's family, there is no interrupting whatsoever, and there's actually very little spoken communication. They're not a heavy communication family, so their listening culture is primarily to listen instead of to speak. And again, culture can be relevant to family group or country group, language, religion. There's a lot of different definitions in culture there that you can study beautifully in Chapter 1. There's a wonderful section on culture in Chapter 1. Now, of course, nonverbals do play a role in listening. If someone is making eye contact with you, nodding and smiling, you are more likely to pay attention to what they have to say. If they are looking at their phone or have their arms crossed or have turned away from you, then of course that is communicating a lack of attention, a lack of active listening, and can be a setup for a good old-fashioned argument. So whenever you are being communicated with, make sure that you are showing nonverbal signs of engagement in that conversation and not shutting them down. Lastly, of course, gender and sexual orientation do impact listening styles and strategies. Different brains are wired differently, therefore different communication methods have to be used in order to communicate with them. To back it up for just a moment here, what I'm about to say are generalizations. They are not rules of law, so be careful there. Is that typically males tend to be action and time oriented. That is the typical wiring in there, where they prefer to have purpose behind the communication and for it to be in a compact amount of time. Whereas females typically end up being more interested in people, conversations, and content. And again, those are generalizations, those are patterns, those are not laws. So I can introduce you to quite a few people who would break those two generalizations I just mentioned. So again, being aware and inclusive there. But the gender choices and sexual orientation definitely impact the way that we do communicate. And there's a lot of pretty cool research out there about that. But that's a topic for another day. So I hope that you have an absolutely wonderful rest of your day, and I made it underneath 20 minutes again, and I am so proud. You have a wonderful day.